I'm Catherine Pompilio, Associate Editor of Lawfare, with an episode of Chatter for October 2nd, 2022. At the time of this recording, Hurricane Ian is moving towards South Carolina after flooding homes, shattering buildings, and trapping civilians in Florida. Ian is one of the strongest storms ever to hit the United States. For today's episode, in light of Hurricane Ian, the team at Lawfare decided to cross-post this week's episode of Chatter, a podcast hosted by David Priess and Shane Harris that features in-depth discussions with fascinating people at the creative edges of national security. In the episode, Priess chatted with author Eric Jay Dolin about the history of Atlantic hurricanes, with a special focus on federal government activity related to storms and how we define national security. This is Chatter.
Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess, publisher of Lawfare. This week, author Eric Jay Dolin on hurricanes and governmental response.
Hurricanes make you realize, for lack of a better word, how puny humans are. It would be nice if in the future we did, on average, a better job of dealing with hurricanes and their aftermath. The scientists have spoken and they have said hurricanes are not going away. There has always been an extreme imbalance in the way that human beings respond to risks. And we don't spend money on things that could result in saving thousands and thousands of lives. And I think that perhaps hurricanes or dealing with weather disasters falls into that category.
Eric, welcome to Chatter.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's a tough time for the East Coast of the United States. We're in the peak of hurricane season. And as soon as I started thinking about hurricanes and their implications for, everything from humanitarian issues to national security issues, I thought, I really want to talk to Eric Jay Dolin, because I remember reading a couple of years ago, one of my favorite books about hurricanes, A Furious Sky, which gives a history of America's hurricanes. And I thought it'd be good to chat with you about all kinds of issues related to these storms that seems like every year we face, some years worse than others, but they raise a whole bunch of issues. You're not a meteorologist by training, and yet you really capture a whole bunch of angles of hurricanes. How does someone who's written books about America's pirates and lighthouses and the fur trade and whaling, how is it you ended up doing a full, extensive treatment of hurricanes?
Well, this is interesting. I've written 15 books, and all of them except for 2 have been topics that I've come up with. And actually, the hurricane book was not a topic I came up with. Its genesis came about. You remember the hurricane season of 2017 when we had Harvey, Irma, and Maria?
Yeah.
Just an absolutely obliterating hurricane season. Accumulated damages of $265 billion. Kept us all riveted to our television sets to watch this destructive fury rain down on the United States and some other places. And after that hurricane season, I was in between books, and I was looking for a new topic. And my editor at W.W. Norton and the head of sales at W.W. Norton were talking about book ideas. Mm-hmm. And just having survived this horrific hurricane season, they said, I think there's a need for a book on the history of America's hurricanes, and we know just the guy to do it. And that's Eric Jay Dolin. So they reached out to my agent and pitched this idea, and my agent sent the email on to me, and my response was positive, but I needed to find out more about hurricanes. I didn't know much about hurricanes at all.
Right.
And so I said, well, give me about a month. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go off and read a bunch of books on hurricanes and see if I can envision an outline for this book. And that's what I did. And I came back and I said, and I had to write a proposal. And getting to the sort of the second part of your question, I am not a meteorologist. I'm not even a historian. I mean, I am an historian because I write books on history, but my undergraduate, master's, and PhD are all in biology and environmental and public policy. I'm not a trained PhD historian, so almost any topic that I've written about has been totally new to me. But I do have some science background. I think that helped me a bit in approaching this book. But basically, any book I write has a lot of elements that I'm unfamiliar with. And I approach it the same way, whether those are scientific elements or social science elements or military strategy. I just try to get to the documents, primary and secondary, that best explain to me what happened in a certain situation. And then I feed it into my synthetic blender that's my brain and come up with the outline and then the different chapters of the book. There were parts of this book that were more difficult for me, like the section on chaos theory and some of the mathematics that went into computer modeling. But as you know, having read the book, I don't go into depth about that. This is not a mathematical treatise on computer modeling or the ins and outs of chaos theory and how that might or might not affect hurricane behavior. I go over those topics in a general sense because I'm writing for somebody like me who's a generalist. However, I want to be quick to add that many, many meteorologists have gotten in touch with me and love this book.
Right.
And that's been one of the most gratifying things is some of the meteorologists I write about in the book have actually written to me and saying, this is the best book I've ever read on hurricane history. And I know that a number of schools that have meteorology programs use it as part of their curriculum. So that's really one of the nicest compliments that I've gotten.
I think that makes sense because you have a very story-based style of writing in your books where you get vignettes about people who were involved in various places in history that tell the story very well without bogging down in date after date, event after event. It really brings alive the narrative, whether it is about hurricanes or lighthouses or whaling. So that I think that is a theme that makes it readable. And honestly, hurricanes are inherently interesting for, I think, most Americans. Maybe not people in Alaska, but and maybe the deep interior West. But otherwise, I mean, you've got an average each year of about 6 Atlantic hurricanes. A major hurricane hits the U.S. on average every 2 years, and that appears to be slightly more common now than in many decades past. And certainly if you're in Florida or Texas or the Carolinas, you care intensely about hurricanes because they care intensely about you.
Absolutely. And I would actually quibble with the notion that people in Alaska aren't interested in hurricanes. They're not interested in the same way that the people in the states you just mentioned are, who can be physically and personally touched by a hurricane's wrath. Yeah. But there is an element of, for lack of a better word, when you're on a highway and driving and there's an accident and there's rubbernecking, people want to see that. They can't help but be drawn in by the hurricane coverage, especially now that we've got 24-hour weather stations. And most news stations realize that the reason weather is such a big part of most local and national newscasts is they realize that people are intensely interested in weather and what weather phenomenon is more exciting, more dramatic, and more devastating than a hurricane. So it's sort of like the same point can be made for pirates. I think people all over the country are interested in pirates, not just people that live on the coasts. And with hurricanes, I have yet to meet somebody who is not just fascinated and scared by hurricanes at the same time.
You make a good point there because the hurricane coverage on, let's just pick the Weather Channel, the audience numbers that go up during a major hurricane aren't due to just the people in the hurricane's path, and probably not even largely due to the people directly in the hurricane's path. It's people all over the country and presumably all over the world who want to see Jim Cantori being blown around in the wind.
Yes, it's true. It's fascinating, compelling, must see TV. And I have to add, there's a problem there, I think. Hurricanes don't need to be sensationalized, but I think in many instances, and I'm not picking on the Weather Channel, I think that it happens in many different areas.
Yeah.
They can be sensationalized, and you
Mhm.
can be overwhelmed with the amount of information. And that's a balance that I think news organizations need to pay more attention to, because while you want to inform people, especially people in the path of the hurricane,
Mhm.
you don't want to absolutely freak them out or
Right.
numb them
Right.
with so much coverage that they don't know what to do. And so there's a fine line between informational, exciting
Mhm.
coverage and overload, and sort of almost purient hurricane coverage. It just
Sure.
becomes a thing in and of itself.
And the effects of the latter are that it can actually get in the way of effective warning and action before a future hurricane. Because if there's sensationalist coverage over some kind of superstorm that's coming and it is hyped beyond the threat, then when the threat is actually greater, people don't believe it. And we've seen that at several
Oh
points,
yeah.
even in modern history. So I think you have a good point. It's exciting, it's interesting, people want to see it, but there has to be some level of ethical consideration as well when it comes to some of this coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that happened, what you just said happened with respect to Hurricane Sandy in New York in 2012.
That's
There
right.
was another hurricane a few years before, Hurricane Irene,
Mhm.
that was really hyped up in the coverage. And it caused significant problems in New York, but nothing near what people predicted it would,
Hmm.
the impact would be. So as a result, Mayor Bloomberg and the National Weather Service and other people who were trying to get people along the path in New York and New Jersey
Mhm.
to pay attention to evacuation requests and the like, they faced a little bit of sort of hurricane sensationalism fatigue. And it's like the what's the parable? I'm totally forgetting of the big bad wolf, or
Yeah,
some crying wolf too many times.
that's right.
If you anesthetize people to the real situation. And I
Mhm.
think it doesn't just happen with hurricanes; it happens with almost any kind of coverage of a dramatic event. After a while, people tune out, zone out, and they also get very upset if they're forced to upend their life for something that in the end is deemed by them to be inconsequential.
It's understandable. Well, long before Superstorm Sandy, I mean, we talking about American hurricanes, we can go way back. Of course, hurricanes have been hitting what is now the United States for thousands of years, if not longer.
Yep.
But without much recorded history, we don't know much about it. But once we get to the British colonies in the United States, your story really picks up because you immediately link it to one of the most colorful people of that revolutionary generation. And you tie one of the first scientific advances in hurricane forecasting to none other than Ben Franklin. What did Ben Franklin do, and why was it important?
Ben Franklin, he's a founding father, as they say, our founding scientist, just an amazing individual. He seems to be everywhere all at once during most of his lifetime, weighing in on different topics. And he was a very well regarded, famous scientist and inventor to some extent. And in 1743, there was going to be an eclipse that he wanted to witness from Philadelphia. And bad weather came in, a hurricane rolled in,
Horrible timing.
and he assumed that, and he wasn't able to see it. And people at the time thought that hurricanes sort of arose and died in roughly one area. They didn't really understand the concept of forward movement, and also the winds that were striking him were coming down. They were going south, sort of southeast or southwest. So he was surprised to learn later that the eclipse was also not witnessed in Boston,
Hmm.
where his brother was. And he sort of put two and two together, and he said, well, this massive storm must have moved from Philadelphia up to Boston.
Uh-huh.
And so he was the first person to give us a sense that hurricanes could have forward movement, and they could move in a direction opposite of the wind, the predominating the wind in your area. So essentially, he was on the left side of the hurricane. The wind was coming down from the Boston area, essentially, but the hurricane was moving northeast towards Boston. So
Right.
it's not it's an important discovery. But what happened after Benjamin Franklin made this observation is essentially there were no improvements in hurricane forecasting or understanding for many, many years, something which caused Thomas Jefferson, a weather nut, to complain that the field of meteorology is one of the most sort of retarded in the sense that it hasn't moved forward for many, many years. While during the Age of Enlightenment, a lot of other sciences really started to explode. But so that's Benjamin Franklin's contribution. And also just think about in 1743, we didn't have forecasts. We didn't have GPS. People had experienced hurricanes all the way back to Christopher Columbus' time. And before that, the Native Americans and Central Americans and South Americans, they had witnessed it for time immemorial. But so hurricanes were rather dramatic, sudden events. You could get some sense that there might be bad weather on the way, but you didn't know if it was just going to be a minor thunderstorm or a major hurricane. And given how buildings were built back then, the devastation could be absolutely traumatic.
Sure. I was fascinated to learn that same eclipse hurricane that led Benjamin Franklin to make that observation about geography and wind direction also led John Winthrop to first measure the barometric pressure and realize that these hurricanes were these massive low center systems. So you had 1743, a remarkable year, but as you pointed out, there wasn't a lot of follow-up just because a lot of the scientific instruments weren't there. We didn't have the collection that we grew over the years, such that it was only a few decades later when the course of the American Revolution may have been affected dramatically by two hurricanes. I want to say it was 1780. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
yes,
there were a couple of hurricanes that were very important in the Caribbean, and one in particular that damaged a whole lot of British and French ships. So what did that do? How did the French in particular react to the issues of the hurricanes during that season, and how did that affect the revolution's course?
Yeah, during the summer of 1780, there were actually 4 hurricanes in quick succession, but 2 of them were particularly important, or actually one was super important. The Great Hurricane of 1780. Before it was the Savannah-Lamar hurricane.
You got to figure if they call it the Great Hurricane of 1780, that's going to be a big one.
Yeah. So what those hurricanes did is they intentionally swept through the Caribbean, where both the British and French fleets used the Caribbean bases, their colonies there, as places to reprovision, get not only supplies but also rest their men before going out on whatever military campaigns that they felt were most profitable at the moment. So both the French and British fleets were down there, and they got absolutely devastated, walloped by these hurricanes. More than 22,000 people were killed. Scores of French ships went down with many soldiers on board, and close to more than a dozen British ships were destroyed. So the message, or the lesson, that the French took from that devastating hurricane season was that they didn't want to be in the Caribbean during the next hurricane season, 1781. So they spent this winter of 1780, 1781 repairing their ships. And then in the summer of 1781, they decided to sail north for 2 reasons. It wasn't just because of the hurricanes, but they were allies of the Americans. So by sailing north to help the Americans during what became the Battle of Yorktown, they not only got their fleet out of the Caribbean, out of harm's way most directly, but they also were aiding their allies. And it was absolutely critical in the Battle of the Chesapeake. If the French fleet hadn't been there to basically stop the British fleet from resupplying Cornwallis and the rest of the British soldiers in Yorktown, things might have ended quite differently. But as we know, the way that it did end is the French fleet gave George Washington and his French soldiers who were fighting alongside him the breathing room, essentially, to pursue an onslaught and beat Cornwallis and his men and capture his army in October of 1781. And that Battle of Yorktown and that great success really was a major turning point in the American Revolution. The Revolution would continue for a few more years, but that major defeat, which was so painful to Great Britain, and not the only defeat that Great Britain had suffered at that point, but a particularly grievous one, that really kickstarted the move towards negotiating the peace, which took a number of years, and there was still some more fighting before it was finalized in September of 1783. So I think that a very good argument can be made that hurricane, in particular the Great Hurricane of 1780 in mid-October, influenced the course of the American Revolution. But I want to caution you and your listeners, you can't know exactly what would have happened if an alternative reality had taken place. That's one of the problems. You can't have a test case. It's not like science. You have a control and the actual event. But you can speculate, and I think that there's a lot of basis for arguing that hurricane did have a determinative effect, and certainly was very helpful to the Americans at a critical moment.
It brings to mind a novel I read several years ago by Robert Silverberg called Roma Eterna, which was an alternate history novel of the Roman Empire that did not fall. And it continued, and it ended up governing even a wider swath of territory and for much, much longer. And eventually, a major hurricane ends up playing a key role in the plot. And then I realized, it kind of did that for the American Revolution too. You're right. The what if is hard to play out. Counterfactuals are notoriously difficult to get much purchase on, but it's easy to imagine that the French could have made a different decision without that. So obviously, the Americans are learning that hurricanes really do matter in some really big ways. And yet, surprisingly, for the first, 80 years or so of the United States existence, there really was no federal role in trying to even predict the weather, to even forecast for hurricanes. It wasn't, right. I think it was a U.S. Grant as president in 1870 who gave the U.S. Army Signal Corps responsibility for gathering weather reports over at least part of the country. Why do you think it took so long for the United States government to do basic weather collection and forecasting?
Yeah. Well, actually, you have to step back at least a decade or two to an informal collection that was sponsored by the newly created Smithsonian Institution.
Mm-hmm.
The Smithsonian Institution before the Civil War did invest a fair amount of money in essentially sending out barometric equipment, rain gauges, and early anemometers, other things to weather watchers throughout the country. And they, in turn, using the new invention of telegraphy, would send in their observations. So the Smithsonian Institution was trying as best as it could to collect data on weather phenomenon, not just hurricanes. In fact, hurricanes wasn't their main focus. They were more interested in agricultural applications and trying to understand, frosts and rainfall. So they were really working very hard for a few decades on that. And it was a rudimentary system that gave them some more information about how weather worked, and also sometimes distributed useful information to individuals, but it wasn't organized. And the Civil War sort of put an end to these informal weather watchers around the country, because half the country was severed from the other half for a number of years. And the Smithsonian Institution suffered a great fire and was in a little bit of shambles itself. Yeah. But after the war, instead of going back to resuscitating its efforts before the war, the institution decided this is really something the federal government needs to take over. And Ulysses S. Grant administration agreed. And you're right, they created the Signal Corps, which is essentially Army employees. The Army would gather information about the weather, would report it to a central location. They would try to give advance warning of storms that were traveling over the Great Plains or into the eastern United States. Occasionally, they would give some information about hurricanes or major storms moving up the coast. But the problem with the Signal Corps is they were plagued by controversy. There was a major case of embezzlement. There were a lot of Army men who really would rather be fly fishing than tracking the weather, and they would write up a whole pad full of observations and reports to be sent out by the local post office, in effect, or the telegraphy office, and that guy would be off fishing. I mean, there are a lot of stories like that, and there was a lot of controversy. And as a result of that, in 1891, the federal government decided to take weather responsibilities out of the Signal Corps and give it to this new Weather Bureau, which was in the Department of Agriculture. And that was a significant step forward, because by that time, there were more and more reports coming in. Telegraphy was connecting more of the country, and there were some advances in the understanding of hurricanes, not enormous advances, but the ability to predict what was going to happen was getting a little bit better with regular weather occurrences, and maybe marginally better with hurricanes, because one of the problems is hurricanes are coming in off the ocean.
Right.
And this is right before we have radio. So telegraph lines are only as good as far as they go. There were some underwater telegraph cables that went from Florida and the Gulf down to some of the islands in the Caribbean. So you could get a little bit of advance warning of a hurricane that was coming through the Caribbean and maybe moving up towards the American mainland. But if the hurricane was barreling across the Atlantic and then took a right-hand jog and went up the East Coast towards Virginia or North Carolina or South Carolina or even northern Florida, even if a ship at sea could experience this hurricane or be on the outskirts of it, they had no opportunity to alert the people on land to the oncoming storm. So that required the arrival of radios, of wireless transmission of information, which absolutely revolutionized weather reporting, especially relating to hurricanes.
There are a couple of degrees of irony here in this period. One is that initially this responsibility of gathering weather reports was given to the U.S. Army Signal Corps, primarily because of the supposed precision and discipline of the military. But as you've said, they weren't showing a lot of discipline in their weather reporting. And then going forward in 1891, I think you just said that the Weather Bureau was moved to the Agriculture Department. Then you had a pretty big hurricane season. 1893 was historic for its devastating nature, and yet it didn't really lead to a real change in government resources. It was a national security event that ultimately did that, which was the Spanish-American War in 1898 that actually led to, I think, a president being really interested in hurricane prediction because of the possible implications for the U.S. Navy and efforts in the Caribbean.
Oh, yeah. President McKinley was really worried about hurricanes. He was more worried about hurricanes than he was about any Spanish forces that might be going against the Americans, because he realized that the power of these hurricanes, they could wipe out the entire American fleet if they hit at the wrong time. But the war was over so fast. There weren't any advances really during the war. After the war, the Americans invested a little bit more money in getting information from Puerto Rico, Cuba, other places. But it wasn't as much of an advance as you might think, especially after the 1893 hurricane season, where there was massive devastation along the coast from Louisiana up to the Sea Islands and the Carolinas, and even New York got walloped by an unusual hurricane. So all I can say about that is my history working. I've had a lot of different jobs. You ever saw my resume, you think I couldn't keep a job. I've been a full-time writer since 2007, but I also worked for the federal government for the better part of 10 years for 3 different agencies. And I can tell you, the federal government and bureaucracy is a lot like a battleship, and moving it is often quite difficult in the absence of an extremely powerful administrator or executive or congressional appropriations. So what happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were incremental improvements, but for a variety of reasons, the government just didn't invest in weather forecasting the way that it could have. But I want to cut them a break. There still were a lot of technological advances to come that were going to greatly help the meteorologist's ability to predict the future. So even if they pumped more money into it, they might have had marginal improvements, but it wasn't as if they were suddenly going to be unerring forecasters of all sorts of weather phenomenon because they were limited by their technology and their ability to see the future.
That makes sense. And obviously, in the coming decades of this story, you do start to get some of that technology. But it's fascinating for the modern mind. We are used to a major storm hitting, and almost immediately you start hearing word of, federal declarations of aid and activation of FEMA and the president visiting the area. And that is a very different mindset than most of American history. I mean, we mentioned the 1893 season when a huge hurricane hit South Carolina. The governor called on Clara Barton and the American Red Cross for assistance. There was no significant federal role. And then the very famous Galveston hurricane of 1900, which was absolutely devastating, brought a whole bunch of financial aid to the city, but it was from all kinds of groups and individuals, not from the federal government as such. And I think that is something that is surprising, that the US government, for all of its core purposes, did not really include helping the states with natural disaster management and recovery until relatively recently, in recent decades, really. So when you
Right.
were researching this, was that something that surprised you, that the federal government was really absentee? Yes, they were doing some forecasting, and that evolved somewhat over these decades after decades, but that the role in dealing with hurricanes when they did hit was so small.
Yes. Part of that, I think, has to do with federalism and the division between the central government and the states. And, an extremely powerful executive didn't really come about, I would argue, until FDR. I mean, he sort of transformed the role of the presidency.
Mm-hmm.
Congress was a collection of representatives of different states, and one might have thought that the individual congressman or senator would have lobbied for funding for their communities
Sure.
that were hit by hurricanes. But I don't know the reason why that really didn't take place in the early 1900s like it does certainly now.
Mm-hmm.
But I would tend to ascribe it just to the slow evolution of the power of the central government versus the states. And also there being other priorities that were just more important. I mean, with respect to the 1893 hurricane in South Carolina, part of the reason that there was a lack of interest in aid was racial to some extent. A lot of the Sea Islands that were struck were the homes of the black individuals called gulas at the time. They still refer to themselves as that. And they were not deemed as important to save as if they had been white communities. But then again, in Galveston, you're right. A lot of the support flowed in from a variety of companies, but it wasn't centralized, as was the case for Katrina in 2005, where the vast bulk of the funding that came to New Orleans and the area hit most dramatically came from the federal government. It was a huge amount of money. So to answer the question very specifically, I suppose I'd have to write a book on the evolution of federalism versus state responsibilities and why the federal government has become so involved in a whole host of activities that they didn't used to get involved in. But I really believe that the ultimate answer would come down to the incredible increase in the size, power, and the finances at the disposal of the federal government over time.
Sure. In the 1930s, you mentioned the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt did task his newly created Science Advisory Board to analyze the Weather Bureau's hurricane forecasting, and they found it very, very wanting. And Congress did appropriate more money to improve the program, but it really went along with the rise you mentioned a few moments ago in technology. You did have weather balloons in the 1930s, but hurricane force winds don't really work too well with the balloon technology they had at the time. So I think the real crucial development, and one hell of a story, is the 1943 flight, the first Hurricane Hunter flight. Can you walk us through that? Tell us that story and just how remarkable it was.
Yeah, in 1943, there was a guy named Joseph B. Duckworth who was in the Air Force. He had been a former pilot with, I think it was Eastern Airlines in the late 1920s, and that was just when flying by instrument was becoming a real thing. Most of the time, pilots, when they flew, they would have to fly during the day because they would use the landmarks that they were visible as their map, essentially, as guiding them along the way. But if you had really bad cloud cover and you couldn't see the ground, that was a real problem, and you probably wouldn't take off. So instrument flying and knowing your elevation, knowing your pitch, knowing where you are in space was a very useful ability to have, especially if you were the military, which wants to be able to fight its Air Force in both good conditions and bad. So by 1943, Joseph Duckworth,
yeah, absolutely. You're right in the middle of the Second World War. This is crucial.
Yeah, so Joseph Duckworth was he was the flight commander in Bryan, Texas, at an airfield, and he had a bunch of British flying aces over there using these AT-6 Texans, which are small, open cockpit planes, and teaching them some more stuff about how to fly and how to be in combat. And a hurricane was predicted to hit the Galveston area, and the brass higher up was contemplating moving all of the AT-6 Texans and other planes further inland to keep from being destroyed. And the British guys were making fun of Duckworth and the Americans for how frail their great fighter planes were. And they said, well, when we're in Britain and there's a storm, we just lash things down on the tarmac. It's not a big problem. You guys are a little bit of sissies. And so Duckworth, first he disabused them of the notion that a hurricane was just a bad storm, because these guys hadn't experienced it, because hurricanes really don't hit Great Britain. The remnants of them do. So after he said, this hurricane is a different kind of storm, you guys are not familiar with it. But he also placed a bet. He said, I'm going to show you how good these AT-6 Texans are. I'm going to fly one of them into this hurricane and come back. And that was not approved by his superiors. So he got a navigator to come with him. They hopped in a plane. They were flying towards the hurricane. They talked to a local air traffic controller to ask a couple of questions and basically told him that they were heading towards the hurricane. The guy says, "What? Are you serious?" And then he said, "Please tell me who you are and all your call numbers, everything, because I want to know who to notify when you don't return." And so they kept going, and Joseph Duckworth was planning on only going into the edge of the hurricane and then turning around, not going into the eye of the hurricane. And lo and behold, it wasn't a very big hurricane, and he went into the edge of the hurricane, and then he broke through the eye wall, and all of a sudden he was in the middle of an eye of a hurricane, which is very calm compared to all that's swirling around it. And then he flew back out, went back to the airfield, landed. Everybody was absolutely amazed. Not only had he proven the strength of the 86 Texans and his own level of guts, but also he was flying blind essentially for most of the flight when he was in the outer rings of the hurricane. He couldn't see a darn thing. But when he landed, the head meteorologist of the airfield said, "Oh, this is amazing. Can you go up again? I want to see this."
Right after he violated orders.
And he did. He turned around and they flew up again. And this time they took more detailed notes. So they got some valuable information about the dynamics and the characteristics of the hurricane. And he came back. And that flight basically ultimately led to the inauguration of the hurricane hunter flights, because the head of the Weather Bureau heard about this and he goes, "That's just what we need. We need to be able to fly into hurricanes. This guy proved that you can fly into a hurricane. And if you fly into a hurricane and you have some instruments on board, you can take readings and it can give you some insights into the character and perhaps the future movements or development of that storm." So this was a major advance. But it wasn't until the late 40s and early 50s, really, when hurricane hunter flights became more and more common. And we still do them today. And they're very important because they give the people on land real-time information about what a hurricane is doing and provide reams and reams of data that can be plugged into now computer models to help figure out what the hurricane is going to do in the future. And what's amazing about hurricane hunter flights, and I remember when I was researching this, I had never heard of hurricane hunter flights before I started working on the book. And the amazing thing to me reading about these flights was learning that they weren't all that dangerous. They're not a walk in the park. But one hurricane hunter pilot said the most dangerous time for him was driving to the airfield and climbing up the stairs into the airplane. And believe it or not, with thousands and thousands of hurricane hunter flights, only 6 of them have ended in disaster. And only one of those was in the Atlantic in the mid 1950s when an entire plane was lost trying to get some information about Hurricane Janet. The other 5 hurricane hunter flights that were lost were all in the Pacific Ocean, and they were trying to get information on hurricanes of a different name, which we call typhoons. But a typhoon is just a hurricane in the Pacific Ocean. So after all of these thousands of flights, only a few have resulted in fatalities. But that's not to say that the flights are smooth. They aren't. In the 50s and 60s, the people on board the flights, the Weather Bureau personnel, as well as the military personnel, would often refer to particularly gnarly flights as hairy hops. And there are stories that I have in the book of very seasoned airplane pilots and naval pilots losing their cookies, essentially throwing up because they were being, bounced around so much going into the edge, the wall of the hurricane, and then into the eye. So it's not without risk, but the ultimate risk of losing your life takes place in vanishingly small percentage of flights.
The other amazing things about these hurricane hunter flights, in addition to the fact that there have been so few fatalities, is the fact that even with the advent of satellite technology in the 1960s and very advanced ground radars reaching further out, that the data from them is still so crucial because you get the instruments that drop through the layers of the hurricane and are reporting back several times a second various aspects of wind, of pressure, of precipitation, temperature. And yes, we would be much, much better off even if we only had satellites and radar compared to what happened 100 years ago. But we would be much worse off even with those if we didn't have these hurricane hunter flights. So it's a good thing that they are, if not smooth, at least not lethal in most cases.
Yes.
That leads to a different aspect of flying into a hurricane, which are efforts to actually stop hurricanes by doing various things, usually with planes. Got a lot of attention a couple of years ago when the former president made a comment about, we should just nuke the hurricane to kind of stop it or send it off course. It was not the first time that idea had come up. That had been coming up for many decades, in fact, since we had nuclear weapons technology. But talk about a couple of those methods that people have come up with to try to either weaken a hurricane or change its direction, and if any of them are known to be successful.
Yeah, the most formal effort, which was sponsored by the American government, was basically to seed clouds with different elements, either dry ice or silver iodide, and basically the idea was that if you seeded the clouds that were enwrapped in a hurricane or in the outer edges of a hurricane, you would cause precipitation. You would basically disrupt the energy equilibrium of the storm and maybe break it apart a little bit and weaken it. And there was a Project Cirrus and a Project Storm Fury that spanned a number of decades where they had planes that would go out and drop these seeding elements into clouds. And the results were totally sometimes confusing. But the one thing they didn't do is prove that we could use that technology to actually change the course of a hurricane in any significant way. But other suggestions that have come along, and there have been many, some people have recommended towing icebergs from the Arctic down to the Caribbean and the warmer waters to cool down the waters, because as you know, in order to have a hurricane, you basically need the surface temperature of the ocean down to about 150 feet to reach the trigger temperature of about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So the idea was if you had a bunch of icebergs, they would cool things off and the energy source for the hurricane would be cut off. Another idea was to take propeller planes, and this is an earlier idea, to take propeller planes and fly them around the outer edges of a hurricane in a clockwise direction, because in the northern hemisphere, hurricanes circulate in a counterclockwise direction. So if you fly them around the outside of the hurricane in the opposite direction, you somehow would create, opposing forces that would unwind the hurricane. One person recommended putting windmills on the coast and having them, through their operation, basically blow the hurricane off course, which is a crazy idea. Another guy wrote a letter to the head of the National Weather Service or the Hurricane Center saying that his mother had an incantation that he knew would work if they would only bring him up in a plane so he could say this incantation and disrupt the hurricane. And there have been other ideas that are not so silly. One idea, I don't know exactly what they called it, and I don't talk about it in the book, but I read a little bit about it, is the idea is, again, to cause a circulation pattern in the ocean to bring cold water from very deep areas up to the surface. And there are these long tubes that people have talked about being suspended vertically in the ocean and going down quite a ways, and somehow through the dynamics of, it's almost like a siphoning process, bringing cold water from beneath up to the surface and thereby cutting off the energy source for the hurricane. And the one that you mentioned is recommended a lot of times, dropping nuclear bombs into the hurricanes. Now, there are a number of reasons why that absolutely wouldn't work. First, hurricanes are incredibly powerful, and dropping a nuclear bomb, even a couple of nuclear bombs, would probably not disrupt the hurricane to any great degree. The amount of power in an average hurricane is the equivalent of 10,000 nuclear bombs along the lines of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Now, we do have more powerful bombs today, but the real reason you wouldn't want to drop nuclear bombs into a hurricane is, what better way could you conceive to distribute nuclear radiation over a large area in a relatively short amount of time? And then the final thing just has to do with hubris and pride. Americans seem to think that they can play with Mother Nature and not suffer the consequences. But I think history has shown us time and again that there are unintended consequences of our interventions. So I, for one, would have no confidence in our ability to try to take on hurricanes with nuclear bombs for fear of what other things might happen. And, a last thing I'd say is hurricanes are part of the natural system. If we suddenly came up with some amazing technology that could eliminate hurricanes, I have no idea how that might affect the distribution of heat and cold over the entire surface of the planet.
Right.
It might have some pretty dramatic effects that are even worse than the hurricanes themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a little bit of humility should come into play when thinking about manipulating hurricanes.
Certainly with the incantation, I think humility is in order. But frankly, all the other ideas you just mentioned, whether it's, cloud seeding or tow some icebergs, put some tubes down, windmills on the shore, and certainly propeller planes, even if you have hundreds or thousands of them going in a direction, all of them seem to just underestimate the size and power of a hurricane that you could tow. It would be just unreasonable. I don't even know if you could tow enough icebergs. If you could tow
No.
hundreds or thousands of them, would that even have an effect on how large the ocean is, how powerful ocean currents are that carry the warm water in, and then the size of the hurricane itself? It's looking for a technological solution for a very, very big problem.
Yeah, there's a real problem of scale. And hurricanes make you realize, for lack of a better word, how puny humans are
Right.
and
Right.
human efforts. I mean, just think of like Hurricane Sandy was almost 1,000 miles wide. Hurricanes can reach from the surface up to 50,000 feet
Mm-hmm.
into the atmosphere. And many of them are 50, 100, 200, 300 miles wide. And the amount of power in a hurricane, just an average hurricane,
Mm-hmm.
is the equivalent power to half the electricity generating capacity in the entire world. So it's just, I think it's a pipe dream to think that we are going to be able to manipulate hurricanes into submission.
Right.
And that leads us to the harder discussion of how do we adapt and live with hurricanes as best as possible.
Yeah, and we've proven and being collectively we, not just you, you and me, we collectively have proven we're not very good at, inhibiting our development or being careful with protecting wetlands and all of the things that we take for granted until a hurricane comes.
Right.
And some of that is, frankly, overdevelopment in areas that are prone to hurricanes, maybe not in the memory of any one individual. I'm thinking here of the Miami area, which had several hurricanes. I think a major one was Betsy sometime in the mid 60s, but the growth of the Miami-Dade area and the population, doubling in just a few decades, such that when Hurricane Andrew hits in 1992, very few people had living memory of a major hurricane near the area, and yet it was an absolute crusher in terms of its impact when it hit, for a compact storm, not as big as Sandy, but I'm old enough to remember it, and the absolute devastation in areas from, down by the Northern Keys up to, north of Fort Lauderdale. Talk about the importance of Andrew, both in the American imagination and in terms of what it meant for the development of FEMA and the modern sense of hurricanes, both forecasting and recovery.
Yeah, Hurricane Andrew, as you mentioned, was a very compact hurricane, a very powerful hurricane, Category 5 hurricane, and that's defined as having sustained winds of above 157 miles per hour. It could have been a lot worse than it was, and it was bad enough because the eye of the hurricane and the main part of the hurricane didn't hit Miami head on. It was a little bit further to the south, and the communities of Homestead and parts of Miami-Dade County were absolutely devastated, and 160,000 homes were either destroyed completely or made unlivable, and that tens of thousands of people were made homeless overnight. And it became the most expensive hurricane up to that point in American history costing about $27 billion. But the number of deaths were actually relatively minor. I mean, any death is bad, but it was on the order of 20 to 30 deaths, depending on how you define the number of people who died. And part of that was because there was evacuation and the like. But Hurricane Andrew on its own, I don't think had a dramatic impact on how we forecast or understand hurricanes. Although there's a great story of Brian Norcross, a local meteorologist who was on the air during the days before the hurricane, during the hurricane, and after. And he played, I think, a critical role on helping people in the Miami-Dade area understand what was approaching, react appropriately. And I have no doubt that his stellar reporting during that hurricane set a standard, and also probably did save a number of people who listened to them because he was a trusted local meteorologist. So in that sense, it really showed the good side of reporting on hurricanes and how it can help individuals avoid the worst outcome. FEMA did come in, the Federal Emergency Management Administration did come in after the hurricane. There were a lot of complaints about them not coming in fast enough and hard enough. And President Bush at the time got an earful, and as a result, the response after that sort of ramped up. So FEMA got some credit during that hurricane for its response, as well as some criticism. But the larger issue is Americans are pretty bad in general, and I think humans are, in investing significant amounts of money in events that might not happen for a number of years and are not immediate concerns. And FEMA, under the first President Bush, was known as a patronage dumping ground. There were a lot of people who worked there who had political connections, and not because they were very good emergency responders. It also was often starved of funds. Things shifted a little when Clinton came in, and there was more funding. And for the most part, those years, FEMA had a pretty good reputation. They had a really good administrator, Jamie Witt. And then when the second George Bush came in, the FEMA was wrapped into the Department of Homeland Security, and its profile was greatly reduced. There were funding issues, and it really became a patronage dumping ground and was totally unprepared for responding to major disasters like the one that Hurricane Katrina provided. But I'm not trying to blame individual presidents or administrations, because it's not unique to Democrats or Republicans. I really think that Congress and the president and Americans in general, they don't have a long range view. Oftentimes, they're focusing on the immediate future. And when you ask somebody, whether it's a government or an individual, to invest a lot of money right now that they could use for other purposes for an event that may or may not take place years down the line to get them in a better position to react to that situation, it's a very hard sell. And Americans are often very good at responding to disasters. After something happens, they'll go in and send in the cavalry. But wouldn't it be nice if we had a little bit more forethought and investment and good decision making on the local and federal level that put us in the position of responding more effectively and efficiently to future natural disasters, including hurricanes? And that's just a generalization. I mean, there are individual hurricanes and other disasters where the government, local and national, has responded wonderfully. There unfortunately are a lot of situations in which that wasn't the case. And to give them the benefit of the doubt, hurricanes are massive events. It is very hard to stage a recovery effort, no matter where it is, and no matter how well prepared or well funded you are. So we can't expect perfection, but we've had a number of examples of poor performance and good performance. And it would be nice if in the future we did, on average, a better job of dealing with hurricanes and their aftermath. And the last thing I'll say about that, the biggest issue, I think, is global climate change.
Sure.
Hurricanes are not going away. The scientists have spoken, even though there are some people who disagree. They have looked at the data and they have said that the world is warming. I'm not going to get into why that is. It doesn't even matter whether it's human induced or not human induced. The world has become warmer. There's been melting of glaciers. The average height of the ocean off the east coast of the United States, especially up around New York and New England, is a foot higher than it was a year ago, meaning that storm surges from hurricanes are starting from a higher platform and can be more devastating. And what the scientists are telling us is that the signal that they've picked up in the last 40 or 50 years is that hurricanes have been getting stronger and wetter, and it is related to the heating up of the atmosphere, because after all, heat is the main driver and engine of hurricane formation and sustenance. So what we're facing is a future, a warmer world in which hurricanes are likely to be stronger and wetter. No scientist who's a good scientist can tell you exactly what's going to happen 5 years from now, 10, 20, 30. But what they are making clear in all of these reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other reports that have been coming out in recent years, and whenever they're interviewed on TV, they're trying to give people a sense that hurricanes are likely to get worse. We need to adapt better. And also, if we can possibly reduce, I believe that a lot of the heating in the atmosphere is the result of anthropogenic emissions. So wouldn't it be great if we could reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and maybe ratchet back or slow down the heating of the planet a little bit? It'll benefit us in so many ways, not just with respect to hurricanes. So it's really it's a very difficult problem. But to get a little bit more granular, people who live in the path of hurricanes can make better zoning decisions for their communities. They can build stronger structures. They can pay attention to evacuation orders and not ignore them, and not get upset at the government not being correct or 100% on the spot every time. You've got to give people a little bit of leeway and slack. And they're not going to get it right every single time, because this is a complex phenomenon. But you shouldn't let that cause you to put down your guard and not listen to any government warnings about hurricanes. So there are a lot of things that communities can do. Whether they're going to do them, I mean, some have. And I have to add, because this is not really discussed in my book a lot. I'm just giving you my own thoughts. My book basically goes up through the hurricane and the direct aftermath, the long tail of the hurricane, and how people are recovering, and what communities and governments do to improve their reaction the next time a hurricane comes, is really a topic that somebody else can take up in a book.
Right.
And it's a very complex issue, and I didn't feel that it fit in this book the way that I had envisioned it. But I still felt like sharing with you my perspective.
No, and it's fascinating, because hearing you talk through all that, I can't help but think that there's a double-edged sword to our, frankly, fantastic hurricane prediction, and the improvement, even in our lifetimes, dramatic improvement of the cones of uncertainty of hurricane prediction, such that you have, on average, when a storm is coming, you have days, sometimes a week's warning that it's a possibility in your area, and you can have significant movement of assets out of the area. And I say assets, of course, human assets, meaning human lives evacuating, But I go back to Andrew in 1992 again. I remember reading an in-depth story many years ago about the Homestead Air Force Base at the time, now the Homestead Air Reserve Station, but the Homestead Air Force Base, that they had the 482nd Fighter Wing and Maintenance Squadron there, and they flew most of the planes up to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Others were flown
Mm-hmm.
to other bases elsewhere, such that 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 Air Force Base was demolished. It was essentially leveled,
Mm-hmm.
but most of the assets there were protected. And I feel like because our forecasting and our technology has gotten so good that many people can avoid the impact of a major hurricane in the way that the perhaps 10,000 people who died in the Galveston hurricane in 1900 simply could not. So we
Oh
get
yeah.
this sense that this is something we can handle. And yet, as we see with the flooding in Texas a few years ago from even a relatively minor storm on a hurricane severity scale, or you see
Mm-hmm.
Katrina, or you see these other storms, in some cases, it doesn't matter how good your forecasting is, it is still going to overwhelm levees and coastal defenses that are made for things less than a once every 100 or 200-year storm.
Uh, I couldn't agree more. And even if you have advance warning, your response is only as good as the responsiveness of the local community, the government, their evacuation plans. I mean, all those things working. And we have plenty of examples where they've worked and other examples where they haven't worked. But you mentioned the Air Force Base down in Homestead. Well, when a hurricane, I'm going to Newport News next week to give a talk. When a hurricane is forecast to hit perhaps in the area of Newport News or
Yep.
another naval installation, what they often do is
Get
send
all
their
the
huge
ships out.
ships
Yep.
out to sea
Ride
because
it out.
you can handle these big aircraft carriers and other ships in really bad weather. But if they're tied up at the dock, they're going to get smashed against the dock. I mean, they could be totally destroyed. So
Yeah.
forecasting has saved who knows how many lives, and who knows what the total value of infrastructure it has saved over the years, but it has been monumental.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, in this regard, and extending it to a bigger question, I want to bring up a quote that President Obama gave when he was giving a speech in New Orleans in 2015. He said, "What started out as a natural disaster," referring to Katrina, "became a man-made disaster, a failure of government to look out for its citizens." And the analysis of Katrina points that out at the local, the state, the federal government level as a series of failures, as you've mentioned, in
Mhm.
development and zoning, in maintenance of levees, and then, of course, in the horrible response there. But what Obama pointed out there was treating hurricanes as a governmental issue, showing that great evolution we talked about earlier from the federal government playing very little role to the fact that the federal government is deeply involved. And when you have hurricane after hurricane doing the kinds of damage, that they do, it seems to me, I've come from a counterterrorism background. And if we had a terrorist group that successfully every summer blew up a handful of houses in the United States and killed their occupants, we would be on virtual lockdown in this country and it would be headline news. And yet
Right.
every few years we have dozens, in some cases hundreds, and occasionally thousands of people killed by these storms. And yet
Mhm.
we don't treat it as a core national security issue in the same way. We don't marshal resources and treat it like everything changes because of a major storm. Having looked at this whole history and the evolution of American cultural understanding and societal awareness of these storms and what we do about them, what do you think about the way that we as Americans think about a natural disaster like a hurricane compared to something like a terrorist strike?
Huh. That's a really good and valid point, and it's hard for me to answer that. Uh, However, I would say that because hurricanes are these natural phenomenon and a terrorist attack is not a natural phenomenon and also involves a lot of political ramifications and the perception of an enemy infiltrating our country or attacking us at our core, there's just a different visceral response. We know that hurricanes are going to come every summer, more or less, and we have to deal with them. They're part of life. Just like driving down the highway and realizing that 50,000 people are going to be killed every year in highway accidents, we still go down the highway and take our chances. And it's sort of, it almost becomes part of the background noise after a while. And I think that makes it a little more difficult for people to focus on. It's a recurring threat, but they're also implied in your question, and it's true, there has always been an extreme imbalance in the way that human beings, not just Americans, respond to risks. We sometimes throw enormous resources at risks that are relatively inconsequential because somehow they trigger us. And then we don't spend money on things that could result in saving thousands and thousands of lives. And that's a subject better taken up for another guest of yours who understands psychological how people respond psychologically. Right. But it's true. There are hundreds of examples of that. And I think that perhaps hurricanes or dealing with weather disasters falls into that category. If you had a set amount of money to spend and your goal was to save as many lives as possible, you could make an argument that investing more in hurricane preparedness and other related technological advancements and the like might be a really good investment. But human beings they don't judge all threats equally. And certainly terrorism in the last couple of decades is just a hot button issue for so many people. And to give a current example today, this is not parallel at all, but I think there's something in it that relates to the question that you just asked me. Queen Elizabeth just died. It's an international event. The amount of news coverage going to that in the last couple of days, and certainly for the next few days, is overwhelming. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be that coverage, but by the same token, the war in Ukraine, which is very important and garnered a lot of attention early on, is not getting as much attention, nearly as much right now, especially with this new offensive, as Queen Elizabeth's death. And therein lies something about people's attention span, what they focus on. And it's not 100% parallel to what we were just talking about, but there's something in there about how people respond to threats or stories or what they choose to focus on that is really intertwined with human nature. And I'm not arguing that people don't focus a lot of attention on hurricanes. They do, but we could do a better job, I think.
There's one other element that occurs to me could be a part of that, which is, as we've discussed, other than the people who think that they can tow enough icebergs or fly enough propeller planes around it or use incantations, generally people understand that a hurricane is such a force of nature that it can't be stopped. It's something that just must be endured. Whereas I think there is a popular conception that, terrorism or war in general can be mitigated in a different way. Maybe it can't be completely stopped, but damn it, if we put enough billions or trillions of dollars and enough measures and security protections, and we can dramatically reduce, if not stop, the threat of terrorism, at least from a particular group or a particular region. So maybe that's part of the psychological difference, is the feeling about being able to do something about the threat instead of just being subjected to it without the power of control by taking extra measures. That
I think that's a good point.
Yeah,
that sounds right to me. And that's also overlaying that. It's just different people have different perception of risks and what to do about those risks. And people are not internally consistent.
Sure.
Nor are governments.
Let me ask you, as we begin to wrap up our time here, about the popular view of hurricanes in mass media. And I'm thinking here not just the Weather Channel and Jim Cantori or a Brian Norcross type story, but in popular film. So we've had a few major storm films that have featured hurricanes or similar storms, and they probably have a greater influence on people's understanding of hurricanes than any other source. And I don't know if you remember the Day After Tomorrow, the movie from
Oh
2004.
yeah, that's the one about the superstorm that
Right.
freezes everything, right?
Which seemed absolutely ridiculous that there would be a storm that would basically span the entire United States of America on the East Coast. Of course, this movie was something like 7 or 8 years before Superstorm Sandy, which from a satellite view was almost as massive as the ones they were fictionally representing. But the Day After Tomorrow has this, crazy storm that develops seemingly out of nowhere with, of course, the one, wonderful scientist who actually predicts it. And then you have some other, The Perfect Storm and some other natural disaster movies that feature hurricanes or similar storms. But in my mind, there's nothing that really is as compelling in the popular imagination as some other movies are for their genres. And I'm wondering if you think it's possible to make a really good hurricane movie, or if any good hurricane stories almost necessarily boil down to the individual whose house is ripped off the foundations and they crawl to the roof, and then it gets ripped apart and they get taken miles away, and then they jump on another piece of driftwood, that it almost just becomes a personal survival story instead of a story about the storm itself.
Yeah, I'm not a screenwriter, but I have no doubt that a talented writer who's familiar with the constructs of Hollywood and movies could come up with a compelling movie that hews more to the accuracy of the story that they're portraying and make it compelling, because in the end, what gets us riveted to hurricane coverage are the human stories that come out of it. It's not purely
Absolutely.
the meteorological characteristics. So I think that somebody could do it, but I have to add that there are a number of documentaries about hurricanes, such as Katrina or the Lake Okeechobee hurricane. And I've seen a few of those, and I believe there's a great documentary, The American Experience, about the hurricane of 1938 that struck New England primarily. I find those extremely compelling watching. It's not a movie treatment like The Day After Tomorrow,
right,
but it is a visual, it's a movie of sorts, but it's just a documentary.
right.
So I'm sure somebody out there could do it, and I'm sure there would be an audience for it, because, as you know, having read the book, there are a lot of individual stories that are absolutely compelling and tragic at the same time.
Yeah, it's the view that divides America as much as anything else, which is the view of the movie Titanic. And the correct point of view on that, of course, is mine, which is, if you understand the history of the Titanic, there are so many compelling, just heart-wrenching human stories involving the passengers of the Titanic that any one of them, or many of them collectively, could have provided an amazing screenplay to do a movie on. And instead, James Cameron went the direction of, largely making up a story with just a couple of elements of the, I think there's one couple in particular that is based on absolute truth, but most of the story being fictionalized. And you're thinking, why? A documentary about the Titanic in some ways is a more compelling human story than this, one of the best-selling films of all time, in a fictional way.
I think so, but to give Cameron the benefit of the doubt, people love stories, especially love stories of people who come from different parts of society and are thrown together. So, yes, I agree. I think that there could be a great dramatic treatment of the Titanic that was based on actual events, actual individuals that people would want to watch. But, for what it is, Titanic's a good movie. It's enjoyable to watch.
When one watches it with the lens on of that the main character, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, is actually a time traveler. And it just makes it much more interesting. It's like trying to watch the Star Wars franchise with the story going in your mind that, Jar Jar Binks is a Jedi Knight and secretly mastering everything, or a Sith Lord secretly mastering everything. It makes some troublesome movies much better.
Well, I will add one thing.
Yeah.
Don't go to Hollywood if your goal is to get the truth about
You
history.
have a great point.
Sometimes they do a good job, but that's not why you go there.
Hey, as somebody who worked in the intelligence business and has seen a lot of so-called spy movies, I can't agree with you more. That's definitely true. Well, let's end by reaching into our chatterbox and pulling out a random question for you. Eric, name one dead political or national security related leader from any era that we could really use right now.
Oh my goodness. Oh, okay. Well, I'll do it broadly. I mean, one of my favorite characters in history who has some very problematic elements to his own personal history, but did many great things and has some characteristics that I think we're desperately in need of leadership, is Teddy Roosevelt. I was like Teddy Roosevelt, particularly because of his what he did for the environmental and conservation movement. I don't like his view on eugenics and race theory, but I like his incredible, incurable optimism and leadership abilities and ability to rally people and to fight what he believes in so passionately. And again, I see that most clearly in what he did for conservation, National Park Service, National Wildlife Refuge Service, which is very important to me given my background. So I'm always hoping for great leaders to step forward and help unify our country and send it on the right path. And of course, I think that path is my path, but we won't go into that. So Teddy Roosevelt would be my selection as somebody who could help us out with his personality right now. But so I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you for offering TR. That's always welcome here. And thank you for joining me for this whole conversation. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.